in January. Okay, the other thing I need to do is do full screen here. Nope. That. Yes. And it might pop up because I'm going to mute the microphone and then it's going to hear him talk. So it's going to say, did you mean to unmute? So that's going to be kind of annoying, but just, yeah, have fun with it. So, okay, this is James. He's a developer. You're up in Denver, right?
Yes.
Okay, so he's going to go ahead and kick it off for us and talk about Sass and PostCSS. Take it away.
All right, let's see if I can get you some slides here. And that looks good. Application window. And you can see yourself now. And there's slides, huh? Cool. So I want to talk today about using Sass and PostCSS together. And the reason I want to talk about this is because as a developer, I don't learn from my mistakes very well. Years ago, there was this cool new thing called Sass, and I heard people talk about it over and over and over again. And I thought, hey, that sounds great, but my CSS is awesome. I can write it. I don't need help. I don't need this other tool that makes me learn a bunch of other stuff and have to use a command line. And I'm great as is. I don't need this. And then that feeling started to shift from, I feel like I'm behind everybody now. And maybe these benefits really do outweigh the startup costs. But now I feel like I have no idea what to do because Sass is a huge thing and there's a million blog posts about it at this point. And I really don't know how to get started. So what do I do with that? And yeah, trying to figure out all the things. And eventually I got to a conference, CSS DevConf up here in Estes Park. And I yeah, heard a talk about learning one thing is better than learning a million things. Learning a million things is fine, but if you try to focus on doing that right away, it's hard. Learning one thing gets you through the door, and that's bigger than knowing 0 things. That was really helpful, and there's some really good talks on actually how to use Sass, and that was a concrete kind of intro for me. And from then on, I really loved it. And then I hit a similar milestone a little while later with a different tool. Oh yeah. Why would I use Grunt or Gulp? I have a config Ruby file for Compass, and it runs Sass exactly how I want it to. In fact, it even does auto prefixer. And this Grunt Gulp thing is just way too complex. And so I sat on that one for a while, and I felt like I've got something that works well enough already. And I even found a tweet by myself from, I think, 2.5, 3 years ago recently, where I just said a dumb thing like, why would I even need this? I have config Ruby. And yeah, a new tool that I sat there on the edge of thinking, it's not really that useful. And then shifted into, okay, so I see how it's useful, but I'm a little on the scared side of things because it's a big new tool and there's a whole bunch of things to learn. And then I shifted jobs a little more than a year and a half ago, and they didn't use Grunt, they used Gulp. And this time I didn't even have time, thankfully, to fall into my temptation to fall into my pattern. Because it was just use Gulp or else, you know, it's the tool we use, so learn it real quick. And then 6, 8 months later, PostCSS was putting me in the same spot I'd found myself in a few times before. And so this talk is kind of walking you all through the things that I learned that helped me feel comfortable around PostCSS, that helped me get over one more time the fear of too much depth of knowledge that I just can't get through quickly enough, the fear of how do I learn this thing and do the benefits really outweigh the startup cost, the concern about how many more things am I going to add to my workflow and will it really be worth it? And through all that, kind of a little case study, we're going to talk about PostCSS in the middle. So PostCSS is a really cool tool, and you may be hearing about it already on the Twitters or other places. It's meant to be a CSS fixer. Sometimes people give CSS kind of a bad rap. They snark like, yeah, you're only a front-end developer. If you could do databases, you'd be a grown-up. Sometimes people gripe about inconsistent browser implementation, and we all made that worse as a whole as front-end developers by using prefixes the wrong way as production things. And some of the bad rap CSS gets is real valid concerns about inconsistencies in the language and limitations of it. But people always go back to these problems, and we try to fix them because we're not content as devs to let the problem just be a problem. We've got to work around it. There are no loops or logic in CSS. Cool. We can add Sass or less or stylus, and we can get loops. You don't like cross-browser bugs? Okay, cool. You can add auto prefixer or something like that to your workflow, and it'll help you fix some of them. You don't like the current limitations? You can try to write some not yet spec CSS and see how that works out.
Hey, James.
Yeah.
Are you switching slides?
Nope, not yet.
Okay, just making sure. I thought
The
it
intro
was
slide lasts for a long time, sorry.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah, so PostCSS tries to come in and fix CSS in some really cool ways. And I say tries not like derogatorily, it tries and it does a good job. It can process syntax that looks and feels kind of like Sass or one of the older traditional preprocessors. It can fix vendor prefixes for you really automatically and without you having to worry about it or think about it. And it can almost make a really good attempt at making not yet spec CSS possible and usable. Getting a lot of attention right now, a lot of blog posts, a lot of cool stuff happening about it on the internet. And so let's cut through all of that and see what about it is really useful. First idea I want to talk about is the idea of preprocessors like Sass versus PostCSS. Boom. Wow. Together. Yeah, sorry, I guess I could have played the animation for you a minute ago. I'm sorry. So yeah, we're going to talk about Sass versus PostCSS. Then we're going to switch to talking about them with each other and how they fit into the same workflow in a good way. And then the last part is just kind of a little dump of some practical tips I've learned, things I want to avoid, things I think you should do. And we'll end with that practical part. But Sass versus PostCSS, this part really set me on edge as a developer, kind of with that whole fear of learning new things, because a lot of the hype about PostCSS when it first came out was anti-Sass hype. People were talking about, quote, breaking up with Sass. Others called PostCSS the next evolution, with the implication that Sass and less and stylus would be left behind in the dirt. And this dichotomy, I think, kind of pushes newcomers to the whole PostCSS thing to wonder if they need to throw away their old tool, especially if you've invested hours and hours in implementing Sass in your workflow, especially if you're part of a team where you rely on less every day and we're ripping it out with like break code bases badly. When a lot of the hype is about replacing things with PostCSS, it really feels like it's a hard sell to actually get to PostCSS and try to use it. But they're more similar than we think. PostCSS is actually a preprocessor. Ah, nuts, a GIF, and I forgot to show it to you right away. Mortal Kombat, finish him! Is that what PostCSS is going to do to Sass? You already know my answer. No, not quite. But PostCSS is a preprocessor, sort of. It's not identical to Sass or less or stylus, but it does fit into the same part of your workflow that they fit into. It does stuff with CSS before that CSS ever makes it to a site visitor's browser, before that CSS ever makes it client-side. Technically, any tool that does that, hits your CSS and changes it before you ever get through to the server and into a browser, is a preprocessor, technically. Which basically means PostCSS is a preprocessor that you can run after a different preprocessor if you want to. An actual post processor would be maybe prefixfree.js, Leah Verou's client-side JavaScript library that figures out what browser it is and then puts prefixes in on inline styles to match what you need for that particular browser. It actually runs post user visits your website. But PostCSS is just another kind of preprocessor. That said, it's pretty different from Sass and the others. They all, Sass, less, stylus, all occupy a pretty similar space in the preprocessor world. They have their own syntax for variables, repeatable code blocks and loops, logical condition testing to generate CSS. PostCSS, on the other hand, starts with actual CSS and modifies it as needed to create a different, hopefully better, version of that same CSS. I can't see anybody raise their hands. Here I would ask you to raise your hand if you're already using auto prefixer. So I guess y'all can look around the room and see who else is raising their hand. If you're already using auto prefixer, you're already doing the same kind of thing PostCSS does. You're taking a CSS file that would run in browsers successfully but you're making it better by adding needed browser prefixes to help a couple of the modern, air quotes, browsers that for some reason still rely on prefixed versions of the properties. In fact, there's a PostCSS task to run autoprefixer. And that's actually, according to the author of autoprefixer, the right way to run autoprefixer. You can use the gulp or grunt direct wrapper, but running it through PostCSS inside of grunt or gulp is actually preferred. And you actually get slightly different output, and it's better if you use PostCSS. It's more thorough. But shifting away from that rabbit trail, PostCSS doesn't quite replace the other preprocessors. It's not, in my opinion, a Sass killer or a thing that would make you break up with less or throw your whole stylus code base in the trash. Because PostCSS modifies CSS in a different way from the other preprocessors. You see, they all have, and if you've used one, you know this, they all have their own syntax. If you want a variable, you use their syntax to write a variable. If you want to loop through a list of items and create a CSS for each one, maybe social media icon colors, you can do a loop. You can do a for each. If you want to evaluate if a particular condition is true or if a variable has a certain value and then put CSS out differently based on that, you can do that. PostCSS doesn't do all those things natively. It actually modifies actual CSS by using JavaScript. You say, well, how does that actually work? And here's our big word for the night, abstract syntax tree parser. Okay, so what does that mean? A few you probably already know from other dev projects you've worked on or computer science studies or training like that. We'll take a look at CSS first on our way into the explanation. What is CSS? Well, it's instructions for a browser on how to style elements, exactly. But look at this from like a programming point of view. .element and .other element, those are class selectors, and they actually work like keys to a value. The value in this case happens to be an object, a series of key value pairs. The key or property name, display, goes with the value inline block. Padding has an array of two values for its value, 1em and 2em. Same with other element. And if you were replacing curly braces or adding some commas at the end of the lines and putting single quotes around all of this, what you would actually end up with is a JSON object. CSS is really not that different from actual object notation. It's essentially an array of objects. Each object represents a selector and all the properties that are meant to apply to it. But it's just a string in a text file. If you wanted to process all of that, you could write regex and probably hate yourself for it by the time you got done. PostCSS, however, gets in there and it converts the giant string of text that is a .css file that looks like an object but really isn't one into an actual object that you can iterate, loop your way through, which is kind of cool. So it takes a CSS file and turns it into an actual giant JavaScript object. And then it provides you an API, a series of JavaScript functions you can use to A, traverse that object, loop your way through it, selector by selector, and then inside of each selector block, loop your way through every single key value pair, property value pair in the CSS terminology. And as you're looping through, you can test the contents, the keys and the values of those property value pairs according to whatever you want to. And based on the results in that test, you can add, remove, or edit the CSS that's already in your file. And then PostCSS at the very end runs all of that back through its unconverter and turns it back into a giant string, throws it into a text file, and now you've got CSS for a browser again. It's kind of like how JavaScript treats HTML, not as a giant string, but as a series of DOM nodes. DOM nodes have way more details about them than just the HTML elements. Yeah, that's the same way PostCSS treats CSS. Kind of a CSS object model, if you will. But not technically, because that's a different thing that Google Dev Team is working on. An actual CSS OM. So yeah, you can write PostCSS tools that would replace your preprocessor functions, variables, loops, etc. In JavaScript, and then write the syntax that matches them and hopefully get it all to work. So you could indeed replace Sass or or stylus with PostCSS, but that's a lot of work. An important thing to note about PostCSS is, as just a parser, PostCSS does nothing to your file. It converts it to an object and converts that object back to CSS. PostCSS relies on a plugin ecosystem to make all of the changes you want to your CSS. In other words, if you install PostCSS in, say, your gulp file, it's not going to change anything. But once you start giving it plugins, which you get from NPM, and we'll talk more about a few good ones later, those plugins make individual changes to your CSS based on the input you give them. So that's the differences between Sass and PostCSS, and kind of the reason why people portray them as a versus or an anti-Mortal Kombat kind of a situation. But what if they were friends? How can Sass work together with PostCSS? They're not mutually exclusive. We've already seen that. They do very different things, and they behave differently by design. So how can these two tools, how can we amplify their individual strengths and use them together? Well, Sass has a whole bunch of cool built-in things that I think are really valuable. And just so you know, every time I say Sass in this talk, I'm including less and stylus. But I have to say 3 less words if I just use the word Sass. So that's helpful. It's got pre-built features that are really useful. Talk about a few of those. And it's got a really deep and broad community support base. So what are those pre-built features that are fantastic in a traditional, if I can call it that, preprocessor? Variables are the big one, right? I think we're all, if you're on the news, the cutting edge browser stuff, we're all pretty excited about when CSS has a native variable syntax. It's called custom properties, and you can test it out in Firefox, and I think one of the other big browsers has it. Chrome might still be behind a flag, but it's powerful stuff. Variables are fantastic. Remember the good old days when you used to have to change a color because the client came back to a project and said their brand red was a little too warm and it needed to be a little cooler, and here's a new hex code for that? And you would have to do a find and replace on all of your style sheet to get that fixed. And if you had multiple style sheets being used across various parts of the project for reasons, there are reasons to do that, you'd have to find and replace on every one of them. And then Sass showed up and gave you a variable, and you could do variable color brand red. And all you have to do is change it once, compile, and the entire project has the updated hex code now. That's a powerful tool. Conditionals and loops. If this is true, do this. Or for everything in this loop, perform this behavior. For every social media name and color value, put the right color background on the social media share buttons at the bottom of our site. That kind of cool stuff. Functions and mixins, which in the Sass ecosystem, functions and mixins are both like what you would call a function in a different language, like JavaScript or server-side languages if you're using those. But in Sass, a function strictly only returns a single value, whereas a mixin behaves like a function. It can process input, but it can spit out whatever you want it to. So those are all built into your traditional preprocessors, and they're fantastic, and there's already a good team developing each of those tools and keeping all of these things bug-free and stable and great for users. If you want these features in PostCSS without another preprocessor in front of it, you have to use somebody else's PostCSS plugin to make it work, and you're following their instructions about which syntax you have to use, and relying on their documentation and their code and their free time to update things, or their volunteer user community updating things. And these are all the same things people kind of criticized about Sass. But you're getting yourself all of the same frustrations, just with a different label on it. What I'm saying here is I don't see a strong reason to replace these pre-built features in Sass with a different version of the same thing written in PostCSS just for the sake of it. Another cool thing about Sass and the other preprocessors is their community support is fantastic. Sass has been around for, I think, 9 years now. The other's about the same length. And so documentation is stable. It's all in one place. You don't ever have to wonder where the documentation is. They all have home pages that document every single function built into their languages. You've got not only documentation, but conferences and meetups. For a while, Sass has had a yearly conference just to talk about Sass. and Sass topics. I think it's getting harder and harder with CSS or Sass or Stylus or even PostCSS to have a full 2 or 3 day conference just on that with enough new content every 6 months or year. But you've got meetups as well. A lot of the big cities, I think there's at least 18 of them maybe in the US last time I had friends counting, where there's a regular monthly Sass meetup every month. I said that. So yeah, there are conferences and meetups and a lot of community support. And of course, all the user submitted content, blog posts, tutorials, the fanfic of the dev world. And you've got years of built up material and people solving your problems and posting answers on Stack Overflow. And you can get that with PostCSS, but it's much younger. This is not a criticism of PostCSS. I want to be careful of that. It's an advantage, I think, of the older, more established tools. But that's not a reason to walk out of here be smug or grouchy about PostCSS because I don't have any of this yet. If you wish PostCSS had more community in a certain way, use PostCSS and become that community. That's our takeaway from this slide. And that goes for any tool you use. If you feel like this new tool is fantastic, but it just doesn't have the documentation, or nobody's blogging about how to use X, Y, and Z, or all the cool tutorials are behind somebody's paywall and they're selling the videos and the books and they're not giving anything away for free, that's their choice. I'm not criticizing people who make a living doing that. But if you see a hole in a community, don't just complain about it, fill it. Be the community you wish were there. So yeah, hopefully, as you all take PostCSS away from this talk and start to use it, you can be contributing on your company or your personal blog, or writing a tutorial, or helping with documentation, or helping to speak or organize PostCSS related talks at conferences and meetups. But again, the advantage here, I think, does lean toward the older, more established tools in terms of community support. Of course, PostCSS has a handful of advantages over Sass, as you'd expect. Otherwise, probably no one would have written it in the first place. Those advantages are CSS manipulation and custom syntax. Let's talk about manipulation. Just so we're totally clear on what's going on, Sass and Stylus and Less don't manipulate CSS. They generate it. Hope you're catching the difference. What you write into Sass is not strictly CSS that is then manipulated by a compiler. It's a pre-CSS syntax that a compiler turns into CSS. Post-CSS, on the other hand, reads through existing CSS, like we talked earlier, parses it like a giant array of objects, and lets you loop through every single object and manipulate any key or value inside it. It lets you manipulate CSS, and that's a really powerful thing. And there are a couple of really powerful results of that. I'm just going to skip through real quick. Vendor prefixes, syntax cleanup, sorting, and shortening are some of my favorites, and let's talk about those in a little more detail. Vendor prefixes, right? Yeah, we were never supposed to use these in production, but we have been for years. And so if you're in Sass, you've probably seen the Bourbon library, or Compass back in the day when that was a supported project, had the exact same mixin, same syntax and all. If you want to write transform, rotate, parenthesis 90 degrees, and parentheses, semicolon, and get the correct browser prefixes for Moz and MS and WebKit and O, in Sass, you have to write something like this. It's not CSS. It's close, but it's not. And then the compiler generates CSS based on a Sass-specific syntax instruction you give it. In this case, it's a mixin. And just a pro tip, if you're doing like latest 3 browsers as your support requirements, you actually don't need all 5 of those prefixes. You only need 1, maybe 2 prefixes added. We're moving really fast on prefix dropping, and it's exciting, at least to me. Maybe I'm just a nerd, though. So yeah, you would write this if you wanted Sass to write prefixes for you. And if you ever wanted to drop support for an old prefix, like Opera hasn't needed them for how long, and I think Mozilla's been a couple years since it's needed a transform prefix, you would have to go in and adjust your settings in a Sass file that controls your config and use it to tell Bourbon, drop these prefixes on these particular properties. You don't actually directly manipulate, but PostCSS does. I've mentioned auto prefixer, and here's what it does. Look at the syntax you need for auto prefixer. It's just CSS. I love it. It's just the plain spec CSS you'd write, you'd find on MDN or documented elsewhere. No prefixes, no fancy things, no wrapper functions or mix-ins around it. It's just the right CSS. I hit a point in my own mind of maybe a couple of years ago where I realized I was using a mix-in for background gradients, linear gradients in CSS. And I had a few times where I had to write regular CSS. I came into a project that didn't have Sass yet. And that was, weirdly enough, the biggest hurdle for me. I had to go somewhere on the internet, go to CodePen, use Sass there, or sassmeister.com, and have it generate the background gradient syntax. And I realized I don't know CSS right now. There are properties and functions that I cannot tell you and I can't do. And that's fine. We're not supposed to memorize the entire spec to be a good developer. It's great to know where to look things up. It's a better skill than memorizing, probably. I hit that point. I realized I wish I knew the regular syntax, because this is not a complicated syntax. I mean, it is. Okay. Background linear gradients is kind of complicated, but this is something I'm using really often, and I'm always running it through an abstraction, and I don't know what the browser really wants to know anymore. Auto prefixer let me get back to writing exactly what the browser wants to know, a regular spec CSS declaration. I don't have to write a mix, and I didn't have to write a function around anything. It was great. Auto prefixer for the win. It's a PostCSS plugin, and both this and this produce all the prefixes you need. You actually got a danger here in that it may produce too many, and you end up with a slightly bloated style sheet. Auto prefixer runs on your config instructions that we're going to look at later, and only generates the ones you want it to. And that config idea is part of auto prefixer setup in the get-go. Custom syntax is another thing I mentioned. That's a really neat feature of PostCSS that you can't add to your other preprocessors. If you want to use Sass, you should use Sass, but you should know when you get into it, you have to follow their rules for every single piece of Sass you write. This is not a complaint. This is the way frameworks work. If you want to write, I have an opinion about Bootstrap, but if you really had to write Bootstrap, you can't just make up your own class naming system for your columns and your grid elements. You have to follow their recommendation, not a recommendation, their requirement exactly, or else you're not going to get the styles you want. Same thing with any preprocessor. You can't make up your own Sass syntax and add it. There's no extension currently. There are function and mix-in libraries, but there's not an actual extension at the moment. But PostCSS lets you do anything you want with JavaScript, and you can grab your own custom CSS properties. This is not my favorite use of it, and I'll talk a little more about that later, but let me show you what you can do. Yeah, anything you can use JavaScript to transform or generate, as long as you can grab a string and match it to a string, you can write custom syntax using PostCSS. So let's talk about doing columns with some grid math. Neat is a little library that goes along with the Bourbon one I mentioned earlier that lets you create column widths in Sass. It's better and lighter than using Bootstrap classes or all the weight of a Bootstrap or Foundation system, but just as powerful. In fact, I would say more, since you can use any numbers you want to. You're not required to use their 12-column grid or go home. But this mix-in gives you a quarter of the parent width column floated with a margin on it to create a gutter between it and the next element over. That's really what we're looking for in a grid system. You could make up your own grid thing, and I regret this slide using the word grid so much because there's an actual CSS grid syntax that's finalized and implemented in Firefox and behind a flag in Chrome and on its way into more browsers. It's exciting. It's a way to describe an actual grid and not just a bunch of proportional widths and hope everything floats and lines up correctly. So anyway, I wish I'd named this column. Regret. I wrote the slide a few months ago. Here we are today. So you can write your own fake CSS. You maybe call it column span is 3 of 12. And if you can write JavaScript that does math, that says, let's assume that our max width is 1200 pixels, and we want to get a quarter of that, but we want to accommodate a 20 pixel gutter in the middle, and we want to float all the columns to the left and let them stack across the screen in the left to right writing mode, etc. If you can write math that does this, you can write your own PostCSS plugin that lets you make up a syntax for columns and give it whatever value syntax you want. That's phenomenally powerful. If you want to do that, that's great. It can be a really cool tool for a team with an internal boilerplate kind of setup. Maybe you don't want to have a giant Sass library that does everything. You'd prefer to have it in PostCSS. That's fine. This is a great way for you to make up CSS that will never get to a browser. The made up part won't. It'll get converted into real CSS, like a width and a margin and a float property. So that's one cool example of custom syntax in PostCSS. You can't make this up in Sass. Sass doesn't care what the property name is. It sees grid span, or I wish column span, and it says, okay, I'm assuming that's legit, and if it's not, let the browser sort it out. Your preprocessors don't care about that. And yeah, if you can do math, write JavaScript that does math, you can get the exact same output, looks like this, from this as you would from this. Let's look at a quick sample of how to put PostCSS and Sass together in the same project. Kevin, is this a good time to pause for questions? I'm hearing nothing, so I'm assuming. Oh, yeah.
I had to unmute and everything. Any questions right now? Lots of head shaking, so no questions so far.
Cool. We'll stop again near the end. Cool. So I use Gulp. I mentioned that earlier. I like it a lot, and so my next example is going to use Gulp because that's natural for me. And it's just going to show you two tasks, how to do Sass and how to add PostCSS. So here's kind of the bare bones you need to have a Sass task running inside of Gulp. In the top of your Gulp file, you need to have Gulp, and typically glob if you're going to look for files that way. And actually, we don't need it for this part. We probably just need it for watch task. Anyway, I digress. You need Sass, and it's good to have source maps so that you can get accurate source maps for DevTools debugging. And then your task is pretty straightforward as far as a Gulp task goes. You get your source, the main Sass sheet, to the partial to rule them all, the one that imports everybody else. It starts up source maps. It runs Sass with an expanded output style. It writes the source maps, and then it writes the file. And you end up with style CSS in the source/CSS directory. And that's all it takes to get Sass running in Gulp. It's kind of manageable. Of course, now we want to add PostCSS, so we need to define a few more packages. Of course, you would be using package.json to track these all, npm install, save dev if you're installing them for the first time. But we're going to put in PostCSS with the Gulp PostCSS wrapper. Then we're going to pull in auto prefixer, CSS nano, and PostCSS sorting. Just kind of get a flavor of what we can do here. And you could cram this all into the Sass task. That would be fine, but we're going to just use, for the sake of a simple slide, we're going to make a new task called PostCSS. First thing we're going to do is define an array of functions to run inside of there. Prefix was the alias we gave to auto prefixer. And then we're going to give it a config for which browsers to prefix for. Tell it to do the last 3 versions of any major browser. And then we're going to have it sort our CSS. And by sort, I want to be careful with what I recommend here. CSS is an order-dependent language. If you change the order of your CSS selectors, you can change the way your page looks. That's by design. So what I'm not recommending here is being careless with changing the order of your CSS. What I am recommending, this particular tool just stays inside of a single selector block. And inside that selector block, it changes all the properties and sorts them by the same pattern every single time. I have never found an instance of sorting properties inside of a single selector block that adversely affects CSS layout. If you all know of a situation that can happen, a weird fringe thing like that, absolutely tweet it at me. Let me know. I'm really curious about that, and I would start compiling a list if you have case studies or real issues there. But sorting within a selector block is pretty safe. Why would you do that? If you sort your properties by the same pattern in every selector, you end up with more opportunities for repeated strings. And that's a powerful thing because your servers should have gzip compression enabled. And what that does is it actually does a file compression to your CSS, your HTML, your JavaScript, whatever files you want, so that the user downloads a slightly lighter file and their browser unzips it. It's kind of like downloading a zip file from a website, and it's 14 meg, and then when you open it up, you get 23 meg worth of, I don't know, ebooks or whatever. Browsers do that on a per file basis if the server is configured to do that correctly. Sorting gives the server more opportunities to compress it more effectively. So you end up with a slightly tinier file download for your users. Yay, performance. And then if we're in production, and I don't show you this part, but you have a little bit of JavaScript outside of this task in your gulp file that tests an environment flag, gulp PostCSS -- production kind of a thing. And if we're in production, we're also going to minify this thing with CSS Nano. And then we only have 2 pipes on this particular task. We get the source file. That's the same CSS file we created a couple slides up. Now we run it through PostCSS. We run all of the PostCSS tools on it, and we put it right back in the same directory we started. Essentially, we replace the style, the file, with a better version of that file. That's not too much. That's, if I counted correctly, 40 lines of code, maybe 35-ish. And that's, I don't want to imply that this is like simple, and if you've never done this before, like you're not a good developer. No, no, no. We're all great, and we're all learning new stuff all the time. But what I'm saying is you don't need a lot of code to set this up to run and optimize your CSS. There are a whole bunch of more things you can do. It's easy to get gulp files in the hundreds of line long category, but you don't need that for this. You can install PostCSS with a relatively manageable amount of input and a manageable amount of startup time and code production in your gulp file. If you want that gulp file, you want to read it for yourself, the slides here, all the pink stuff are links, and these slides are at jdsteinbach.com/sass-postcss. And you can get that on a GitHub gist with the sample code, download it, install it yourself, and give it a go with your own CSS. And the last thing I promised was practical tips for PostCSS. Hopefully at this point, if it hasn't felt like a fire hose, hopefully by now you feel like, okay, I see where PostCSS has value. I see why I would want it. I think I want to implement it on maybe my next project where there's a chance to do that. What are some of the gotchas and the red flags and some rules to follow? And before I go any farther, I've got my slide warning you that what is coming in this cautions section is my opinion. Okay, what I'm about to tell you is not like the law, and if you ever post CSS differently, you're doing it wrong. It's not it at all. What I'm going to recommend is what I have found to be a best practice in keeping my own code clean and organized and helping me work with things easily. You may have good reasons to break these rules. That's great. They're not rules. They're just my opinions. So let's start. I prefer to avoid non-CSS input for PostCSS. In other words, I keep the 2 sides of my workflow focused on 2 different things. With Sass, I turn not CSS into CSS. With PostCSS, I turn CSS into better CSS. It's better because it runs in more slightly older browsers. It's better because it's more compressed, and it's better because it's minified or whatever else I want to do with it. There are more tools we can look at later. So when I showed you the slide that had the fake grid span imitation CSS property that PostCSS absolutely can turn into real live CSS, I don't write or use any of those libraries. It's not because they're evil or the developers working on them are bad. No, they fit purposes for certain people and certain workflows. As a rule, though, I don't do that. I find it, for me and for the work I do, cleaner to follow this rule. I saw a nifty thing today. It made me chuckle and then also shake my head as like, yeah, we can do that, but should we? It was a PostCSS plugin called Grid Kiss, and it goes into that the new grid syntax, the CSS grid syntax. And that's kind of a challenging syntax to get your head around. So a developer had an idea, like, we can draw ASCII art, right? Remember the thing where you'd open up somebody's source code on their website and like have like their name written in like funny characters, like spelled out like ASCII art, or you see that in Terminal once in a while with an installation, the Yeoman guy. You can draw ASCII art that represents your page layout, like header, sidebar, content, footer, and based on your ASCII art, this PostCSS plugin will read through that all, figure out the proportions, and write CSS grid syntax to match. All right, that's cool. You can do that. I don't prefer to do that. The ASCII art isn't like my jam. Typing all those Unicode characters is tricky, especially the arrows. Yeah, I guess I'm more of a words config kind of person. But if that visual thing is awesome for you and your team really runs, like, that's awesome. My designer can make ASCII art. They've got a cool website they do that with all the time. Your designer can write grid CSS by giving you ASCII art to run through PostCSS. That's a good use case. I don't have that use case. I prefer to use PostCSS only to turn CSS into better CSS. I'm flexible though. You do something different if it fits you better. My other kind of rule is be really careful with polyfill code. Y'all know what polyfill is, right? In the CSS ecosystem. Say something like element queries or container queries, depending on who's talking about them and how recently. Boy, it would be great to do responsive CSS on an element based on how big, not the viewport is, but how big the parent element is. That'd be great. It's not a thing in CSS yet. It's a really complicated thing, and the loops and that it can generate really badly are dangers, and so people work on them. And we're getting closer to that. But some people have written JavaScript libraries, eq.js. You install it in your site. It runs client-side, and using JavaScript to write styles, to generate and modify styles, you can get actual working, relatively stable element queries for the price of one extra file download or a slightly heavier compiled, concatenated file download. And that's cool, and that's all fine and good because that's using CSS client-side to imitate, or sorry, it's using JavaScript client-side to imitate CSS. There is a PostCSS package that is not bad, but one to just be really wise in how you use. It's called CSS Next. It gets a lot of hype. A lot of people really love it because its promises to let you write CSS that hasn't been necessarily approved or finalized in the spec or implemented in most browsers. And what it does is it doesn't do the same thing as a polyfill. It doesn't write JavaScript for a user's browser that makes the browser honor the same kind of layout you would get from a browser that could understand the new CSS. What CSS Next does is it converts the new stuff that most browsers can't understand into the closest approximation possible today with current stable CSS. It's not guaranteed to be identical. All you're ever going to get out of PostCSS is more CSS. PostCSS does not have a way, no CSS manipulating tool has a way to make unsupported CSS work in a browser. The only thing that can do that really stably is client-side JavaScript. PostCSS is not that, so be very careful with polyfill code. Just for an example, the CSS custom property syntax that gives you a kind of variable that runs client-side. It's awesome, but all PostCSS can do with that is figure out all the permutations that a browser would do client-side and write them into the actual style sheet as just normal properties. You know, if that converts it, it's okay. It's not the worst. If you really want to get into writing the next kind of CSS, those new unapproved, unspec'd, unimplemented things, but you want to have a safe fallback for the better part of your users, you can go with it. There are good reasons to use CSS Next in some experimental, cool, and forward-thinking projects. But if your goal is to support a wide user base really stably, CSS Next is not going to get you there perfectly. It's not going to guarantee to make future CSS work perfectly in current browsers. So be wise with that. A JS polyfill might be a slightly better solution if these kind of implementation issues and their stability across older browsers is an essential thing. Or just write the older CSS to begin with, which I know is kind of a pain because that's a lot more verbose most of the time. But be careful with polyfill code is a gotcha, a recommendation I'd make for you. And then I have a list before we finish up of cool plugins I find useful for PostCSS. I've talked about auto prefixer a bunch, so I'm just going to hit it here. PostCSS sorting, talked about that one. Minifier styles of CSS Nano. You say, but wait, James, I already have Sass and that can minify styles. And right, and I also have like a minifier thing that minifies my JS and my HTML and my CSS if I wanted to. So why would I use CSS Nano? It's better, is a short answer. The long answer is it's a very detailed and granular CSS-specific minification tool. Things like your generic system minifier, this gulp minify, or even the Sass minification setting, do mostly white space collapsing. CSS Nano can do more than that. It can find and remove duplicate properties within a single selector block. If you're putting units onto a 0 value, like 0 pixels, which is kind of just a waste of two characters, it'll remove those some deeper level and more granular minification options. It's going to shave another 1% maybe off your total file size, which is great. I wouldn't argue with wanting to shave that off. It's not going to drop it by 30%, but it's a great tool. You like Flexbox? I like Flexbox a lot. It's buggy though. Current versions of Firefox and Chrome and Safari and IE and Edge have different tiny weird issues with some Flexbox Edge cases. Philip Walton maintains a great GitHub repo called FlexBugs that documents a dozen or two of these various bugs and recommends solutions. And somebody was kind enough to write a PostCSS plugin that when that solution that Philip recommends is predictable and automatable enough, you can run this particular tool in PostCSS on your style sheet. And if you've written any code that would be hit by that bug, it can fix it for you. Color guard is cool. Lots of times you end up with a project, especially legacy work, especially CSS that has never been sassed before, and you get 93 variants on colors, and the vast majority of those colors are like one letter or one number away from each other in the hex code. They're so close. There shouldn't be two different colors. That's just a waste. No human can distinguish that. No sensible designer would ever insist the dev implement those two different hex codes. Usually it just bugs drawing colors out of old, Photoshop or Illustrator back in the day. CSS Color Guard can find those really close neighboring colors and let you know what to do with them. And Font Magician will read your font face properties in a style sheet and can automatically generate the @FontFace font importing CSS to get those fonts into your project. Kind of clever. And then an analysis is really wild. Let's say you wanted 1,000,003 details about your CSS. Since it's not a string anymore, since PostCSS sees it as an object or an array of objects, the CSS stats can write a JSON file or just kind of dump a ton of stuff in your console. This is fantastic, I think, for a refactor. I want to know how bad my CSS is today. I've got these many selectors. I've got this many properties. I've got this high of an average selector specificity issue. Run CSS stats before you start your refactor. Run it again after, and you can have hard, concrete numbers on how improved you've done it. Hey, we have 30% fewer unique selectors, and we have 14% fewer overall properties, and we have a specificity level that is far lower and more consistent. Really cool. Use list selectors to see all the selectors you wrote in a particular project, and to scold yourself and others for using ID selectors or other things your style guide prohibits. You can lint your CSS with style lint. You can lint your Sass source files with style lint if you want to set it up that way too. And if you're on a team that does BEM or a similar CSS or HTML class generating system, you can lint that too with PostCSS. You forgot a dash or used too many underscores, it can scold you. Here's a great list of further reading. They're ranked from most intro to most advanced as you go down the bullet list. Again, these are all links in the slides, and I will make sure we get a link to the whole slide deck into Meetup. If you're wanting to read more and feel like tonight's talk was just a whirlwind or just skip the surface and you just got to get deeper, these posts and these articles are going to be really super for you. Thanks. It's been a pleasure to chat with you. And I'm, again, as Kevin said, James Steinbach. You can catch me at JD Steinbach at most of the places we frequent the internet. My blog, my Twitter, my GitHub, that's where I am. And now that we're done with the official slides, let's run one more round of potential questions.
Okay, questions? Okay, we got one.
Can you use PostCSS to create an abstract syntax tree in the browser? Or is it only
So the question is, can you use PostCSS to create an AST in the browser? That's nice. Or does it only run in Node?
As far as I know, only in Node. But you could probably use a plugin like CSS Stats, gets you most of the raw data. Or if you're comfortable writing JavaScript and can console log things, you can turn its array into something that can be spit out into a JSON file or run in a browser.
Other questions? Somebody had their hand up. I saw 2 hands. You didn't have the same question, I guarantee. Anything else? No other questions. Okay. No other questions. I'll ask, how's the weather in Denver?
Pretty awesome. It was like 79 today.
Yeah? Well,
Yeah.
that's not too far off from what we're at. We're at like 88, 89.
Yeah, that's far enough off that I'm glad I'm here and not there, though.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for presenting. Really appreciate it. And hope to see you at many conferences in the future. Do you have any conferences that you're going to coming up?
No, nothing on the schedule upcoming.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's
Getting ready for the next round of calls for proposal, though, when the spring hits us, probably.
right. Yeah. Well, thank you, and have a great night. This is going to be on YouTube.
Cool.
So if you, I'll send the link out to you and everything. But